Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. The veteran journalist Jonathan Alder is with us. Jonathan is the best-selling author of 4 books on American presidents. He has interviewed 9 of the last 10 and written acclaimed books about 3. The trial of Donald Trump in Manhattan Supreme Court was undoubtedly the trial of the 21st century. Never before in our 235-year history has a former president stood trial in a criminal case, and never before has a former president been convicted of serious crimes. Our guest attended every day of the 23-day trial for the New York Times Opinion, the Washington Monthly, and his Substack newsletter, Old Goats. Then he wrote a terrifically important book about it entitled American Reckoning, Inside Trump's Trials and My Own. And let me tell you, the book is a must-read. We're pleased to welcome Jonathan Alder to the program.
Thanks so much, Jim, and thanks for the kind words. I appreciate it.
Well, congratulations on the book. It really was quite marvelous. And your titles always intrigued me. And American Reckoning, I understand, but then you say, and my own. What was your reckoning?
Well, my reckoning was with my image of myself. So for decades, really, since I was young, I've identified with John F. Kennedy's description of himself. He called himself an idealist without illusions. And for a long time, I thought of myself the same way, but I realized in recent years that I had more illusions about this country than I thought I did. And I'm, a bit, maybe more than a bit, disillusioned. And I had illusions about the common good sense of the American people. And I've been disabused of them now. And so the trial, when I say my trial, I'm talking about my ordeal with Trump, which I think I share with a lot of your viewers. This has been a rough 9 years in American public life. And so, my family and friends wondered, well, why would you want to sit 10 feet away from him for 6 weeks in court? And, it took me back to an interview that I did with Nixon some years ago when I really wanted to interview Nixon before he croaked. So I made arrangements for him to come to Newsweek. And I asked him, President Nixon, how do you think history will view Ronald Reagan, who was then leaving office? And Nixon said to me, well, you have to distinguish between history and the historians, because historians are like you, they're liberal. If you're conservative, you go into business. If you're liberal, you write history or journalism. And Jim, I felt seen by Richard Nixon. I felt like I've got a section of the book called Nixon Had My Number. So all that I bring to the party as a journalist is bearing witness. And so I felt like an obligation almost, an obligation to history to be there. There were no cameras in the courtroom. And I thought that what you rightly describe as the most significant trial of the 21st century so far, even if it's dismissed, which I don't think it will be, this is a matter of real significance, because never before in American history has a future, current, or former president of the United States been convicted of crime.
Well, the present posture of the case, which may change next week before we air, is that you have a jury verdict. There's no judgment of conviction until and unless he's sentenced. And the question is, will he be sentenced? And if he's sentenced, sentenced to what? And of course, the DA says that he wants to freeze the case for 4 years until Trump leaves office. I don't know whether the judge will cotton to that idea.
I think he will.
But if he does, that will bring down the curtain for the time being on the trial that you witnessed. Well, what do you think of those developments?
Well, I mean, they're disappointing in the same way that the election returns basically ended the 2 federal cases, what was really the most significant case, which was Jack Smith's case against him for trying to overturn a legitimate presidential election, and then the other one involving classified documents. So those two cases are dead. The Georgia case is kind of on life support. There's a pretty clear consensus if you combine the Justice Department recommendations and the Supreme Court decision in the immunity case, that he can't be touched while he's president. So my guess is what Judge Juan Merchan, who's a very wise, smart judge who I
he impressed
with,
you.
very much impressed me. My guess is that he'll go along with the prosecution and he will freeze both the immunity question and the sentencing until January 20th, 2029, when Donald Trump, under the Constitution, must leave office. And so we're assuming that Trump will be compelled to respect the 22nd Amendment if he's alive at that point. And at that point,
Or unless it's amended.
so it can't really be amended. It simply can't get through another constitutional amendment. Has zero chance of getting through 3/4 of the states, which is what's required to amend the Constitution.
And
the language,
two-thirds of both houses.
and the language of the 22nd Amendment is crystal clear. It's not
Yes.
like the 14th Amendment question, about whether somebody who had been connected to insurrection could be president. There was wiggle room in that for lawyers to argue. 22nd Amendment, ratified in 1951, crystal clear, president cannot be elected more than twice, and he's been elected twice. So he will, talk about it, but it ain't going to happen. In any event, Judge Merchan, if the motion to dismiss is not taken up, I think he will reject the motion to dismiss in the next couple of weeks, and then it'll be appealed. And my expectation is that those appeals will not be successful on Trump's part. So then in 2029, Judge Merchan will address the immunity question and impose sentence, which I think at that point will likely be probation and a fine.
You don't think Trump will have jail time?
So I think if he had been defeated in this election, I think it would have been more likely that the judge would impose jail time. There is precedent for that in cases of this sort, these business fraud cases. The New York Times found that more than 100 of them had led to jail time, short jail time. But I kind of think in 2029, this is just speculation on my part, I think it's more likely that at that point the judge will impose probation. But I could be wrong. It's an awful long time in the future. And as I said, it's a disappointing outcome. But people shouldn't feel that there was no accountability, because the conviction itself was a form of accountability, and there were a number of small d democratic moments of accountability in that courtroom. Trump was held in contempt of court on 10 counts, fined. That's a form of accountability. He was told to sit down and stop snickering. He sat down like the obedient schoolboy he never was. Every day, 8 times a day, Jim, when the jury would come in and out of the court, and they'd walk just in front of the defendant, that wouldn't look at him. They were kind of soldiers for justice. 8 times a day, the former president of the United States had to stand and honor those ordinary citizens. Vladimir Putin and Viktor Orban don't have to do that. So that was a form of small d democratic accountability, and I'll take my accountability where I can get it.
Well, certainly Trumpists, supporters of Trump, viewed this case as small potatoes, that they're amazed that it was even brought.
Yeah.
Falsification of business records is a misdemeanor. It was enhanced into a felony because the falsification was intended to commit election fraud and also evade the tax laws in the way that it was handled, because it was a cover-up of a hush payment to porn star Stormy Daniels. What's your view of that? You think this case should have been brought? Was it selective prosecution? Was it politically motivated, as Trump alleged?
Well, there's a few different questions there to untangle. First of all, anytime there's a public integrity case brought, by definition, it's selective prosecution. The DA's office in any jurisdiction in this country is deciding that they want to devote considerable resources to prosecuting a politician, in part to send a message of the rule of law. So this was, no more selective prosecution than any prosecution of a politician ever is. As to whether it should be brought, you hear a lot of arguments. Well, the Southern District decided not to bring this. Cyrus Vance, the former DA, decided not to bring this. What those arguments miss is that there was a mountain of evidence that came in later. And so, one of the reasons why it's unlikely that Hope Hicks's testimony will be used to
Hope Hicks was a presidential aide in the first Trump administration.
So her testimony about her conversations with Trump in the White House when the Stormy Daniels story broke, those will be severed from this case because they are covered under official acts under the Supreme Court decision and the notorious decision in the immunity case just earlier this year. But there was so much other evidence that, most lawyers and a former judge I consulted on this say they think there's little chance that the case as a whole will be dismissed. And this so-called mountain of evidence, was relatively new, the amount of it. So everybody assumed that it was just Michael Cohen's word against Trump. But long before Michael Cohen took the stand, he was pre-corroborated by a parade of witnesses. So there was plenty of evidence as to whether this was small potatoes, and also plenty of precedent of bucking it up to a felony. The idea that this was a, quote, novel interpretation. There were hundreds of cases where these misdemeanor business fraud charges were bumped up to a felony. So there's nothing novel about it at all. The other argument that's often used by the Trump people is, well, this was just sort of like a bookkeeping error. This is not an important law. And I consulted a professor at the Harvard Business School.
Of course, there were 34 bookkeeping errors. So
well, but
all about the same transaction.
Right. That was 34 fraudulent checks that Donald Trump wrote, and invoices. But the Harvard Business School professor made a simple, but I think extraordinarily important point. He said, people do not understand that business fraud, falsification of business records, is the foundation of our entire economy. I said, what? Foundation of our entire economy? He said, the difference between the American economy, which is the greatest economic engine the world has ever known, and that of regimes that have crony capitalism like Russia, Hungary, what Trump wants the United States to be, is that business people can trust the courts and trust that if their competitors are engaging in fraud, falsifying records, not making disclosures that are required by law, that they can be held accountable. And if you don't have that, if you don't punish business people for breaking the law, the whole system just collapses into crony capitalism where it's all about, do you know the judge, and there's no transparency for business records. And I hadn't actually thought about that before, but it's very important that society enforce these business fraud statutes.
Of course, it appears that Trump's strategy from the beginning, because of the timing and because of what his lawyers did, and then, of course, it was upheld by the courts, but his strategy was not to be exonerated in court because he knew he couldn't be exonerated in court, but to be exonerated by election.
Right.
And he knew if he won the election, he wouldn't go to jail, and he knew these cases would disappear and one way or another.
And then he'll likely pardon the January 6th insurrectionists as he's promised.
Yes, but of course that doesn't involve him directly.
Right.
But he would avoid pardoning himself because he knew that Jack Smith's cases would be dropped.
Yeah, so he bet correctly.
And he bet correctly.
Yep.
Now, American people are supposed to have common sense. There were commonsensical people on the jury, you wrote. How was it that with knowledge of all the facts involving Trump's violations of the law, his being a sexual abuser, his being a fraudster, that all that came out in the campaign, came out in the debate. A brilliant prosecutor, Kamala Harris, confronted him with the facts and he backed down. He really looked pretty bad. How is it that the American people elected him?
Well, historians, Jim, will be discussing this question for literally the next couple of centuries.
But you're here to bear witness.
You know, I mean, that was what I call the big jury, and the big jury acquitted, even though the New York jury convicted. I don't believe in any monocausal explanation, and I wrote a piece in my Substack newsletter that had 10 different explanations, but the most significant of which is that all over the world there is a very strong anti-incumbent mood, and there have been right-wing governments that have come to power in numerous countries, and if you had a conservative incumbent, as in Great Britain, they also got crushed because all of these governments were held accountable for the inflation that took place after COVID. And it was worse in other countries. But American voters were not going to distinguish how much blame to apply to President Biden. And so inflation is a killer issue. I wrote a book about Jimmy Carter. His political career was destroyed over inflation. It applies to 100% of voters, whereas unemployment applies to fewer than 10%. And many of the people who are unemployed don't vote. So inflation's a much, much worse political issue. And on top of that, Joe Biden, who's been a very good president in many ways, made a very selfish decision in deciding to go back on a pledge to be a transitional figure and to run for re-election. And I wrote in the New York Times and the Washington Post in 2023 that he was making a big mistake. And if the Democrats had nominated a governor who was not connected to the Biden administration and could run as an outsider, that governor, whomever it was, I believe would have handily defeated Donald Trump. But instead they got, a representative of the Biden administration who had to run with that record wrapped around her neck. She ran a very good campaign. A lot of people thought she was going to win. Her mistakes were few, but structurally it was very, very difficult for her because she had so little time to introduce herself and her program to the American people. And she was burdened by inflation, the migrant crisis, and other elements of the Biden record that voters didn't care for.
But of course, Trump was a quasi-incumbent. I mean, he claimed he won the 2020 election.
He wasn't seen as an incumbent.
The voters knew what he was likely to do, what he was likely to give them, as they knew what Biden-Harris had given them.
The voters are, by the way, he won by less than 2% of the vote. So you hear all over the place, oh, big, big victory. What happened was the Democratic base didn't turn out. And he actually got only a few more votes than he got in the last election, way fewer than Joe Biden got. This time he got fewer votes than Biden got the last time, and only a few more than he had gotten the last time. But between 11 and 15 million Democratic voters didn't show up for reasons that we can talk about. But I think and some of it had to do with misinformation, disinformation. Some of it had to do with the Republicans doing a great job of exploiting the trans issue. There were a variety of other explanations, but the bottom line was that she Kamala Harris never ran in any primaries. She built this airplane when it was already in the sky, and the degree of difficulty in winning at that point was significant, especially since, to go to your question, a lot of voters went, okay, Trump was president before, the world didn't come to an end. Voters that I interviewed in Philadelphia would say to me over and over again, I got a check from him, signed by him. I never got that from Biden because Biden was too classy to sign the COVID relief checks. I had more money in my pocket when I was sitting at home during COVID under Trump. And they had almost a little nostalgia for what their personal finances were like before and during COVID. And people vote on their own pocketbooks. For you and me, inflation is something we can handle. But if you are living paycheck to paycheck and the average American has less than $1,000 in savings, you know, if you have a 25% increase in your grocery bill, that's going to mean more to you than what happened to Donald Trump in some trial.
But that was equalized in many cases by an increase in salary, wage increases.
No, it wasn't.
During the
No,
period.
it doesn't. That's not the way psychologically, the way people.
But psychologically, even though they're even, they don't think they're even.
And also, and a lot of times they're not even in their own mind because they think I deserve that raise. And by the way, that raise, you know, maybe I didn't get a 25% raise.Maybe I only got a 10 or 15% raise. Maybe I didn't get any raise at all, which was true for a lot of Americans. And, you know, so they were grumpy like voters all over the world.
You went through this trial, 23 days of trial.
Yeah.
You, listened to the evidence. You heard from Stormy Daniels, from Michael Cohen. You didn't hear from Trump because he didn't take the stand.
Took the fifth, basically.
Basically took the fifth, called one witness who was a disaster for him. Now, having heard all that, having heard the jury verdict, 34 counts of guilty of a former president, it was an amazing outcome. Do you think, as you sit here today, that Trump has been held sufficiently accountable for the crime he was charged with committed in Manhattan?
Definitely not sufficiently accountable. But where I differ from people is that if the trial had been televised, which it should have been, everybody would have seen daily small d Democratic accountability, moments of Democratic accountability.
And you bore witness to that.
I did. So 8 times a day, the jurors would come in and out, and this overweight president would kind of struggle to his feet to honor them. I was inspired by those moments. You know, this wouldn't happen in any of the strongman regimes that Trump admires. You wouldn't see like Vladimir Putin like struggling to his feet to honor ordinary Russians as they come in and out of the courtroom and have his fate in their hands. So yes, ultimately it's the sentence that's the real accountability. But you know, when the judge held him in contempt and fined him, that was a moment of accountability. And when, you know, I looked at him after that jury foreperson said guilty, guilty, guilty 34 times, and he looked like he'd been punched in the solar plexus as he walked up the aisle past me. And then he gets outside, he puts on his game face. But the idea that this didn't take something out of him, not true. And everybody would have seen it if they had been in that courtroom. Or another time, the judge admonishes him, don't snicker in the presence of the jury. Sit down, Mr. Trump. Those are moments of accountability that were very dramatic when you would see them. Or he threatened him with jail time if he reoffended on violating the gag order. And Trump didn't want to squat over a low toilet and sleep under a low thread count sheet. So he cleaned up his act and he didn't reoffend. And that's a moment of accountability. And this was a very dramatic trial. And it's just, I think if it had been televised, I think it would have been hard for him to be reelected, given what I saw. And right now, I'm the only, you know, record of what happened, unless you want to go read the transcripts, you know. And so I have a very acerbic take on this. And so, for instance, when very early in the trial, during jury selection, the judge tells him to sit down. And I said, that's the first time that Donald Trump had to answer for anything since his father died more than 30 years ago. This is a man who, since Fred Trump died, never had to answer to anybody about anything until he entered Judge Merchan's courtroom, where the judge was the boss.
Not above the law. So thank you with that. Thank you very much for coming by, Jonathan Alder. That was marvelous. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. Also, be sure to check out our CUNY TV app, and so you can watch Conversations with Jim Zirin when you're on the go. Meanwhile, take care, be well, and all the best.